Hello, this is Pastor Rodney Garcia. I want to welcome you today to our lesson entitled A Change of Address, and we'll be looking at Romans chapter 6 verses 1 and 2. Before we get into the study though, let's review what we have learned about conversion in our first two lessons. In Romans 5:20, we saw that because of God's abounding grace, there is hope for conversion. In Romans 5:21, we saw that conversion is a transition from sin reigning in our lives to grace reigning. So now let's move on to our text for today. And it says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it?" As we begin, I want to quickly point out that although we have entered a new chapter, we have not entered a new train of thought. Paul is continuing with the points he has made in the end of chapter 5. We know this because of the very first sentence. What shall we say then? Obviously, Paul is raising this question in light of the points he has just made. Remember, in Romans 5:20, Paul makes the point that as sin increases, grace also increases, but much more than sin. And he realized that someone could take that to a wrong conclusion. The more I sin, the more grace I get. So why stop sinning? It is this wrong conclusion that Paul is addressing in chapter 6, verse 1. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? His answer couldn't be more emphatic. Certainly not. Paul wants his readers to know that he is not presenting grace as a license to sin. Now, notice the reason he gives for his answer. It is actually in the form of a rhetorical question. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? The implied answer is, we shouldn't. In other words, should we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. And why not? Because we died to sin, and since we died to sin, we should no longer live in sin. In our previous lesson, we concluded that conversion is a transition from the reign of sin to the reign of grace. And although Paul wrote that the transition can only take place through Jesus, he didn't tell us what must happen in order for us to experience that transition in our own lives. But now he gives us a clue. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? Death is what enables this transition to happen. It is the pivot point that moves us from the reign of sin to the reign of grace. Obviously, Paul does not mean physical death. So what kind of death is he talking about? Well, he doesn't tell us in this verse, but he does call it death to sin. In other places, he calls it death to self. We'll get a better understanding of this, though, when we get into verse 5. For now, let's go back to Paul's point in verse 2. Since we have experienced this death, we should no longer live in sin. So, if we no longer live in sin, where do we live? Well, the only other option is grace. You see, conversion changes our address. We used to live in sin, now we live in grace. A common question at this point is, what does it mean that we no longer live in sin? Does that mean we don't sin anymore? To answer that, I want to point out the connection between verse 1 and 2. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? Notice that we don't have to continue in sin because we no longer live in sin. So to live in sin means to continue in sin. In fact, the Greek word for continue means to remain, abide, tarry, stay. All words that imply where we live. I want to point out that there's a big difference between living in sin and occasionally committing sin because of the weakness of the flesh. It's kind of like the difference between living in a certain city and simply visiting that city from time to time. You see, Paul is not teaching that when we are converted, we never sin again. He is teaching, though, that because of conversion, our lives do not have to be defined by sin. We don't have to continue practicing sin. Why? Because we have died to sin and we now live in grace. So what does Romans 6, 1 and 2 reveal to us about conversion? Conversion is a change of address. It is a transition from living in sin to now living in grace. This transition takes place when we experience death to sin and self.